So welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining. Many of you, I think I've seen on previous webinars, so thank you for joining again for our fourth session of the New Frontiers webinar series. We are really excited to have you here. My name is Lora Iannotti, and I'm a professor of public health at Washington University in St. Louis. I'm also founder and director of the E3 Nutrition Lab and director of planetary health and environmental justice at the new Center for the Environment here at WashU. Today, we are thrilled to host Dr. Jessica Fanzo, a dear friend and colleague who will be presenting on the complexities of ensuring sustainable and healthy diets for everyone. Today's session is part of a large webinar series titled New Frontiers to Prevent Diabetes and Malnutrition, Opportunities for Global to Local Impact. The series, which is co-sponsored by our E3 Nutrition Lab and CDTR, invites leading experts in the field to share the latest perspectives on public health opportunities to inform the prevention of diabetes and malnutrition, including obesity and undernutrition. Just a few housekeeping notes before I introduce our speaker. We will be recording today's session. The recording will be available at the WashU CDTR website. And if you have any questions during the presentation, please add them to the Zoom chat, or even better yet, come on camera and ask the questions towards the end of this talk. So now it is my distinct pleasure to introduce Jessica Fanzo. She is a professor of climate and the director of the Food for Humanity Initiative at Columbia University's Climate School in New York City. She also serves as interim director for the International Research Institute for Climate Society, also known as IRI. Before coming to Columbia in 2023, Professor Fanzo was the Bloomberg Distinguished Professor of Global Food Policy and Ethics at Johns Hopkins University. She has also held positions at the Food and Agriculture Organization of the United Nations, the UN World Food Program, Bioversity International, the Earth Institute, the Millennium Development Goal Center at the World Agroforestry Center in Kenya, and the Doris Duke Charitable Foundation. Wow. She has participated in various collective endeavors, including the Food Systems Economic Commission, the Global Panel of Agriculture and Food Systems for Nutrition Foresight 2.0 report, the Lancet Commission on Anemia, and the Eat Lancet Commissions 1 and now 2. She was also co-chair of the Global Nutrition Report and team leader for the UN High-Level Panel of Experts on Food Systems and Nutrition, a remarkable leader, really, in the global nutrition field. She currently leads the development of the Food Systems Dashboard and the Food Systems Countdown to 2030 initiative in collaboration with the Global Alliance of Improved Nutrition. We are really fortunate to have her today. And so I turn it over now to Dr. Jess.
Great. Thank you so much, Laura, for inviting me to be here. And it's a real pleasure. I wish we could be together in person, but maybe next time. Thank you all for joining in the middle of your hump day on Wednesday to talk about diets and food systems and climate. I'll share my screen and then we'll absolutely leave time for questions and comments. It'd be great to hear from you all. Okay, so today I'm going to talk about the complexities of ensuring everyone can get access to sustainable and healthy diets. This idea, this notion of food systems has been percolating for quite a while. And you can really see that by the plethora of reports that have come out over the last decade, and even more so over the last 5 years. And food systems have become quite high on the international and political agenda, and have become quite important as the interface between human and planetary health. Here's just a few of these big reports that have been disseminated around the world. And of course, one of the seminal reports to come out, although controversial, was the Eat Lancet Commission on Healthy Diets from Sustainable Food Systems. In full disclosure, that I was a part of, that really set the stage for how do we achieve both healthy diets, but stay within planetary boundaries in the midst of climate change. And within that framing, there's been a lot of calls that we need to transform our food systems in positive directions. And one of the reasons for this is because food systems are quite fragile, sometimes fractured, not delivering on all of the outcomes that we want our food systems to achieve. So there's been calls to transform food systems. One of the big reasons why is because we are in the middle of quite catastrophic climate change. This is a set of graphs by Ripple and colleagues showing you the state of climate. On the top are the greenhouse gases, carbon dioxide, methane, and nitrous oxide, all rising, along with global warming. We see ocean temperatures rising, ocean acidity increasing or becoming more acidic, as the graph shows, sea levels rising, ice masses in decline. So the state of the climate is not a positive picture. And climate is impacting food systems. We know that climate change is and will have net adverse impacts on crop yields. This is some work by Jonas Jagermeyer and colleagues here at Columbia and NASA GISS, looking at business as usual, taking little action on climate change. When we look across some of the major crop commodities, showing maize, wheat, soybean, and rice, it's showing the declines in yields in orange, or potentially the yield increase in these different crops. But the gray is showing you where these crops are actually grown. And you can see that out to 2025, maize will have significant declines. This has ramifications in South America, Sub-Saharan Africa, where they highly rely on maize. And you can see this is happening across the southern latitudes. Latitude is here on the y-axis. Wheat will decline in some places, but potentially have bumper crops in the northern latitudes. Same with soybeans. But in most of the places where these crops are grown, there are net declines across these major crops that the world consumes. We also know that in a CO2 fertilization effect, where you have more carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, some plants will be more sensitive to these CO2 concentrations and will potentially have impacts on the nutritional quality of crops, protein, iron, and zinc. And this is showing two maps across the world where declines in some of the major crops of iron and zinc due to the CO2 fertilization will be affected by many different populations, with the darker red seeing more significant effects of both two very key micronutrients, iron and zinc. We also know that food systems are incredibly vulnerable to short-term extreme weather events, climate variability, geopolitical and economic events, conflict. And this is showing from Cottrell and colleagues the spatial and temporal frequency of different shocks that are impacting food systems across crops, livestock, fisheries, and aquaculture, with the darker reds showing the more impact and frequency of these shocks. And you can see here along the bottom over time, more shock frequency, more volatile shocks are happening across all of these major commodity groupings. So food systems are fragile and are consistently being hit by different types of shocks that are impacting their ability to function effectively. And some will argue that we are experiencing what is called a polycrisis, in which you have multiple crises happening at the same time, often termed the 3 Cs: climate change, COVID, and conflict, the long tail of COVID. We're in our 4th year post-pandemic, and this is having impacts on the movement and price of food, fodder, fertilizer, fuel, and finance across food systems. And this, of course, is having significant implications on different outcomes that we want our food systems to achieve, being food security, better diets, nutrition and health, environmental sustainability, and fair and equitable livelihoods. Now, at the same time, food systems are victims of climate change, but they're also part of the problem, and I will argue later, part of the solution. So food systems are contributing to climate change. Of total greenhouse gas emissions in the world, food contributes somewhere between 25 to 35% of greenhouse gas emissions. Most of that is coming from agriculture production, emissions from fertilizer use, methane from cattle digestion, the fermentation, the burping of cattle when they're chewing grass, methane from rice paddies, emission from manure and pasture management, and also land use change, largely deforestation. That's where most of the emissions come from. Other parts of food systems, the transport, the packaging, the retail, contribute somewhat to greenhouse gas emissions, but not nearly as much as agriculture production and land use change. And at the same time, food systems are contributing to environmental degradation, with agriculture being the #1 driver of deforestation, using about 70% of all freshwater resources, and a major instigator of biodiversity loss in both animals and plants. So this is all quite depressing news. But when you look at who is emitting much of the greenhouse gases coming from food systems, it's really just 6 economies that emit about 50% of these greenhouse gas emissions: China, Brazil, the US, India, Indonesia, and the EU. And this is positive because if you could influence and convince these 6 economies to move towards a more sustainable food system, you'd really have a huge impact on reducing greenhouse gas emissions coming from food systems. So if these countries took action, it could make a huge positive impact. Now, at the same time, the kind of diets we consume also matter for climate, also matter for our health. And this is showing you, this is work by Brent Kim at Johns Hopkins University at the Center for Livable Future, different types of American diets, and showing you their greenhouse gas footprint. And so the very left is the typical omnivorous diet where you consume lots of different kinds of foods, including beef, dairy, pig, fruits and veg, legumes, nuts and seeds, eggs, and compared to the vegan diet all the way on the right, which shows a much lower greenhouse gas footprint or carbon footprint. And there's all these variations of people's dietary patterns in between: pescatarian, a fish-based diet, a no dairy diet. So as you move away from more animal source foods, you reduce that carbon footprint of your diet. And at the same time, this might be a little bit hard to see, what this is showing is radar plots of potential risks on human health side. So mortality, heart disease, colorectal cancer, diabetes, and stroke. And on the right of the circle are environmental stresses, water use, acidification and eutrophication or pollution into waterways, land use change, and greenhouse gas emissions. And what it shows is that fruits, vegetables, oils, whole grains are quite low risk for some of these detrimental health outcomes and environmental outcomes. Same with legumes, nuts, and seeds, with different triggers of risk, with water use being one for nuts like cashews and almonds. Here's dairy and sugar-sweetened beverages and eggs. The radar plot widening a bit towards more risk on health and environment. And then over here on the bottom is chicken, processed meat, and red meat. And here's where you can see much higher risks across both human and environmental outcomes, depending on those foods. So what's interesting to look at is that not only are we concerned about the environment, but what kind of foods share or have compounded impacts on both human and environmental health outcomes. And one of the big challenges that we see with diets is its contribution to health, its contribution to better nutrition. And when you look at these statistics, you realize that something's wrong. The scale of malnutrition is universal and in a large part is worsening, with the exception of a few indicators. For example, we see about 735 million people, or 10% of the world's population, go to bed hungry. This number's been rising for the last 5 years. We see 148 million children under the age of 5 who are chronically undernourished or stunted. This number's been declining. When I started off in nutrition, this number was about 40%, and it's come down to 23%. That's quite an incredible success story. But albeit it's been coming down slowly, and still having almost 25% of the world's children under the age of 5 being stunted we're far off course. 45 million children are acutely malnourished or wasted. This number has not changed in many years. It stays quite steady. And 37 million children under the age of 5 are overweight, really unheard of 30 years ago. And 2.2 billion adults are overweight or obese as measured by body mass index, a somewhat flawed index, but gives estimates at the population level. And when we look at this map here on the right, these are the numbers of people in crisis with significant food insecurity. This map is very lit up, and it is incredibly alarming to see how many people are in need of food right now in the world due to, again, the 3 C's: conflict, climate, and the long economic volatility due to the pandemic and other issues. So there's a lot of reasons why we need to change our food system and transform it. But transforming the global food system or to even a local food system is not easy. And the reason why is because there's so many different activities, so many different actors, from very multinational scale to very small scale actors that are engaging in this food system every day. You as a consumer, you as a person engage with the food system sometimes 2-3 times a day. There's not really another system where you engage so much. Hopefully you don't engage in the health system. Some of you might be engaging in the education system, but everyone every day engages in this system. And it's complicated. We have food supply chains, food is produced, it's stored, it's processed, it's packaged, it moves to markets. You are the individual. You come to these food systems and make choices. You bring with yourself your income, your purchasing power, your aspirations, your knowledge, your culture, your tribe, and you make influences. You're influenced by these food environments where you're making decisions. What kind of food is available? Is the food affordable? What kind of product properties do the foods contain? Are they safe? Is it good quality? Is it organic? What are the vendor properties? What kind of retail outlet is it? You bring with yourself all of your individual factors, but these food environments have many choice architecture cues that are influencing your decision making. And of course, our behaviors are influenced by the food system and are influencing the food system, and this shapes our diets, the quantity, quality, diversity, and safety of our diets. And we want food systems to do many things. We want them to have better environmental outcomes, better nutrition and health, fair economic outcomes, better livelihoods, and social equity. But outside the food system are all these drivers that are influencing the behavior and the dynamism of food systems: politics, urbanization, population pressure and growth, migration, globalization, and trade. So all of these different drivers are shaping and shifting food systems in different directions, both positively and negatively. So what are some of the issues that limit food system transformation? Well, one issue is that some countries, some individuals need to make larger changes to their diets to benefit the whole of society. I think that's pretty clear now. Some living in high-income countries, for example, have very energy-intensive lifestyles, very energy-intensive dietary choices that contribute to global anthropogenic climate change. We can see here, this is consumption of animal source foods. Actually, this is supply of animal source foods by countries. You could see the US compared to other countries like Kenya, Cambodia, Senegal. We have a lot more animal source foods to our disposal and access as compared to other countries. So there needs to be a bit more give and take of those who unnecessarily consume very intensive animal source foods. We don't really need to do that from a human health perspective. There needs to be some equity in that. The Eat Lancet Commission also demonstrated this. This was recommending a very plant-dominant diet, as you can see from this plate. A lot of fruits and veg, legumes, nuts, and seeds, less animal source foods. And what you see is that, here's the Eat Lancet health boundary. You can see that globally, the world consumes a lot of red meat, a lot of starchy staples and eggs, but not enough of the healthy fruits, veg, legumes, nuts, and seeds. North America, we consume a lot of animal source foods and starchy staples, but not enough of the fruits and veg. And as you can see in sub-Saharan Africa, a lot of starchy staples and not enough of the other healthy foods and well within the boundary for animal foods. So this just shows the massive inequities and who gets access to what kinds of foods, and how do we start to bridge those inequities and create a more fair system in which everyone can get access to a healthy diet. And we know that inequities are deepening. This is showing you a percentage of the population who cannot afford a healthy diet, with the dark brown being 75 to 100% of the population not affording a basic diet that meets your nutrient needs and is health protective. And this data is now tracked by FAO every year. In this past year, they showed that 3.1 billion people cannot afford a healthy diet, almost 40% or more of the world's population, which is just incredible. But the kind of foods that are available are not so healthy. We're seeing high sales, high growth, high trade of these ultra processed foods. These are foods high in sugar, salts, and fats, and lots of other unrecognizable ingredients that ensure that these foods can be stored for long periods of time, traded across oceans. They're cheap to make, they're cheap to purchase, they're tasty. And and they're very detrimental to human health, and that the literature and evidence is growing in this space quite dramatically. And this is showing you the sales of these different ultra processed foods across each region from 2006 projected out to 2024, and you just see a growth in these ultra processed foods. These are the kind of foods that are available everywhere around the world in deeply rural areas as well. The other big limitation that we have, if we are to transform food systems, is how do we use finite resources, soil, land, water, when we still have hunger in the world? And what this graph is showing you, if you look here in the middle, we use about 50% of the land on the earth to grow food. Of that 50%, about 77% is raising livestock for meat and dairy. But that 77% use of land, that livestock and dairy only contribute about 18% of calories in the global calorie supply and about 37% of protein. Most of the heavy lifting is from plant crops, where they're contributing about 82% of the calorie supply and about 63% of protein. So land is finite. We can't extensify into more space. We can't go beyond this 50%. It's very difficult. So is this the best use of land, of raising these large cattle that require a lot of resources, that are going to be more constrained with heat around the world? So is this the best use of these resources? Well, one other conundrum with cattle is that they are the major driver of tropical deforestation. And you can see that here in this bar, particularly in the Amazon, Congo Basin, and other parts of Latin America, with oil seeds, soy, and palm as the second runner towards a major driver of this deforestation. And this is critical because forests are carbon sinks, but forests also hold a lot of the biodiversity on the planet that we need for a range of ecosystem services, but for our nutrition and for our climate resilience of our food systems. The last issue we face is who shapes and governs food systems. We have massive concentration of the agri-food system, in which we have a concentration of agrochemicals, seeds, animal breeders at the very front end of the supply chain. We've got 1.5 billion farmers, 8 billion eaters, and then we have this massive concentration and consolidation in the middle part of the supply chain, the commodity traders, the processors, the slaughterhouses, the retailers. And that's not necessarily a bad thing, but the concentration of food corporations, they're well coordinated, they have incredible political and economic power that creates a big challenge for governments to govern these entities. And this is a huge issue that keeps coming up when we think about the governance of food systems. Who's actually governing our food systems, and are they looking out for our citizens? And this is just showing you some of the concentration of the top 4 firms across US commodities. So here's soybean right here. Most of the soybean commodity across the US is concentrated, 80% is concentrated among 4 companies. You see this with beef processing. Here's JBS, very famous, Brazil. Got Tyson, Cargill, Marfrig, another Brazilian company, are controlling about 75% of beef processing. So this concentration, not only across the supply chains, but by commodity, is highly problematic when we think about the power imbalances in governing food systems and the directions we want them to go. So how do we ensure inclusive diets within planetary boundaries? And I'll present 4 things and then end with some reflections on research. So I want you to get across 2 points in this figure. The first is that if we do nothing on food, we will not achieve the Paris climate change targets to stay below 1.5 degrees. We fix energy, we fix transportation, we fix buildings. We won't meet the Paris Agreement without addressing food systems. The second is that if we want to stay below the 1.5, have a 67% chance, which is this hatch bar, we need to do lots of things, not just one silver bullet. We need to improve efficiencies and increase yields in agriculture. We need to move towards plant-dominant diets and consume a healthy amount of calories, not overconsume. And we need to cut food loss and waste. If we do all of these, we have a fighting chance to stay below the 1.5 degree. And there's lots of things we can do across agriculture production systems, diversifying towards horticulture crops, legumes, nuts, and seeds, reorienting subsidy policies to promote nutritious crops, use of technology on farms to make them more renewable, more on processing and transport, having industry reformulate, because governments can set standards for reducing the unhealthy components of what's found in foods. Fortifying foods becomes important. More innovation in processing to enhance the nutritional content of foods, and better cold chain storage and transport, which many nutritious foods are perishable and they need that solid transport to keep them safe and avoid loss. We need to fix food environments, making it easier for people to economically, physically, and socially access healthy and sustainable foods. That could mean taxing unhealthy foods, subsidizing healthy foods, removing barriers that inhibit people from physically or economically being able to access foods, investing in public procurement, school meal programs, and more labeling and promotion, providing people information that's easy to understand, front of the pack labels, mass media campaigns that give people solid messages of the latest evidence-based science. So we need to do more, and we need to take action across a whole range of activities throughout food systems. And many of these things have been tried in certain places, cities, some countries, but we need to scale them up. And let me focus just on 4 things. One is around ensuring that we have more nutritious and sustainable food available. And that means allowing for food system actors to be able to adapt. They need tools. Many of the people who produce some of the most nutritious food in the world are smallholder farmers. They have diverse agriculture landscapes. They produce a lot of food for sub-Saharan Africa, South Asia, and Southeast Asia, some of the places where populations are growing still. But a lot of these small-scale actors need tools and information to help them adapt so they can produce nutritious foods and get them to markets in places where these foods can be grown from an agronomic perspective. For large-scale actors, we need to incentivize or penalize them for not producing nutritious or sustainable foods, incentivize them to do so. And of course, invigorate youth to work and invest in food systems and learn from our elder food system experts. The world's average, the age of the world's farmer is about 63 years old. So we need more youth in future food systems. And one of the big things we need to do is get over our staple fetish. When we look at where most of the food is grown and what is grown, rice, maize, and wheat consume about 50% of the world's calories, which is incredible when we have over 5,000 crops that are at our disposal to grow. This puts our global food systems at incredible nutritional and climate risk. And we saw that when 2 countries went to war, one invading the other, Ukraine and Russia, of 2 breadbasket countries producing wheat, we saw a complete shock to the global food system and food prices and food inflation because of the high dependence on wheat and fertilizer from those countries. We also need to promote stronger governance of food environments and actors for better access and information. Things like taxes on sugar-sweetened beverages, establishing food-based dietary guidelines, having school meal programs. These are all really important to increase food access to diverse foods at local levels and in public institutions. And again, we need more regulation to incentivize sustainable food choices through lower prices and disincentivize unhealthy and unsustainable foods through taxation. And a lot of this has to be done at the food environment policy level to help consumers. Another area is incentivizing changes in demand towards healthy diets. There's so many ways to nudge eaters towards healthier choices, but food prices are a big obstacle for many people. And making major behavioral shifts is also an obstacle. And this is a really interesting paper that came out looking in the United States that if Americans substituted 10% of their daily caloric intake from beef and processed meat, and instead consumed fruits, veg, legumes, nuts, and some seafood, not only did they have positive health gains, but they had a 33% reduction in their dietary carbon footprint. That's quite significant. So this idea that you have to become a vegan if you want to be healthy and environmentally sustainable, it certainly helps, but it's hard for people to go that far. But making small substitutions towards lower environmental food chain substitutions can be quite impactful towards both health and environment. And a big question on the demand side is these growth of alternative proteins. There's a massive investment, about somewhere between $8 and $12 billion of investment going into different alt proteins, whether it's cultivated foods, more plant-based foods, fermented foods, insects, across a whole range of products, dairy, seafood, eggs, meat. So massive growth, most of it locked into venture capital. So it's very hard to do research on a lot of these products. And this is a report that just came out by UNEP called What's Cooking. And what they show is that when they look across some of these novel plant-based products, cultivated products, and fermented products, they see some positive impacts on the environment and potentially positive impacts on risk of emerging zoonosis and risk of antimicrobial resistance. But where there's a real dearth of information, you can see here at the very bottom in gray, is the nutritional quality and dietary health outcomes of these products. Many are concerned by the high level of processing of these products and their potential impacts on diets and health. So we need more research in this space. And when we've done some studies looking at Americans and their food choices, we did one study where we surveyed about 1,100 people looking at what are some of the choices that they make when purchasing meat. And the gray and the yellow and the dark blue show the extremely to somewhat important and very important. And you can see that price and taste matter a lot, as do health somewhat, availability, familiarity, quality. But what matters a bit less is the environmental sustainability with US consumers. It's not high on their short list for why they make certain choices around purchasing meat, which is interesting. We did another study in which we asked people to sort 42 foods, different foods, asked them to sort these foods however they thought, color, salt for salty, savory, food group. They could sort them in any way they want. And most Americans sort their food by food group, having grown up with the dietary guidelines. But they couldn't sort some foods. They couldn't sort plant-based milk, Impossible Burger, lab-grown meat. They also couldn't sort ramen noodles. What are ramen noodles? But most of everything else they could put into a food group. But some of these alternative proteins, US consumers weren't really sure where to put them. What food group do they fall in? Interesting exercise of potentially the implications as these proteins start to roll out. The last thing I'll mention is improving national food system decision-making. We've been doing a lot of work trying to help policymakers who are often navigating in the dark on how their food systems are performing, where are their risks, and where can they intervene. And we have two products, the Food Systems Dashboard and the Food Systems Countdown Initiative, in which we are trying to better establish food system science for better decision-making. And I'm happy to talk about this during the Q&A about the countdown, but one quick thing, this was a collaboration of about 65 food system scientists, and we established a 50 indicator framework across these 5 areas: diets, nutrition and health, environment, natural resources and production, livelihoods, and 2 cross-cutting areas of governance and resilience. And this 50 indicator framework allows for countries to start monitoring their food systems over the next decade and just to blow up one grouping of diets, nutrition, and health, you'll see from high-income countries in dark blue to low-income countries, they fall in different places. So, for example, the cost of a healthy diet is less desirable in a high-income country. They're not on a good trend. Same with soft drink consumption and ultra-processed foods. Whereas low-income countries are not doing as well on fruit availability, vegetable availability, minimum dietary diversity. So what this data shows is that no single region, no single country of the world has a monopoly on food system success or on food system challenges. Every country has significant room for improvement, and they can learn from each other. And we've established this monitoring system to really show the strengths and weaknesses at the national level and where countries can start to take action. But there's lots of data gaps, and I'm happy to talk more about the countdown, but it was a big initiative that we will have for the next 8 years, in which we'll publish on these 50 indicators and how countries are performing on their food systems. Let me just end on two last slides for those researchers in the room. You know, it's really incredible. We have so much knowledge. We have so much evidence, more than ever before. We really understand how systems work. We're understanding the risks and the fragility of status quo. But, you know, there's been a long history where scientists have had evidence and have put it in the hands of policymakers, and there was no action taken. You know, the United States knew about climate change in the 1970s. Scientists warned administrations of the US government about climate change, and they took no action. We can argue about NASA and their knowledge of potential vulnerabilities of some of the rockets, but took no action. So the risks of making well-intentioned but inappropriate policy choices are much smaller than the risks of using a lack of evidence as an argument for action. I think we have so much evidence. The question is how do we ensure that it gets in the hands of policymakers and it's useful? We need to sit at the table that policymakers set, not the one we hope that they sit at. And we have a lot of evidence to show that research can chart a positive path towards better nutrition, better food security and health, and it can bring wholesale changes in attitudes, political thought, and action. So for those of you who do research, in a time when facts and evidence and data are under great scrutiny, disregarded with the spread of mis and disinformation, I don't want you to lose faith, because research really can bring bold changes. And a perfect example of that is the buffalo. The buffalo almost went extinct in this country. They once roamed the Great Plains in vast amounts. They completely dominated that part of the country. And they were slaughtered along with their keepers, the Native American Indians. But through data, through better conservation science, they're coming back. And it's such a great story that against all odds and at the brink of extinction, you can pivot, you can make change and chart a more positive path. So I think we have to think of the buffalo when we think about climate change and food systems and better health and diets. We can turn this around. It just is going to take all of us to contribute to the change that we want to see. And I'll end there. Thank you so much.
Wow, Jess, thank you. That was really interesting, compelling, and you might disagree, but I think actually rather optimistic in terms of here's the bleak situation, but here are some solutions. I'll maybe start us off with a question and then open it up. I think that one of your solutions is something that resonates very well with me, which is this sort of, you know, obsession with staples and what that's done both to the environment and to human health. So I wondered if you could say a little bit more about how we incentivize transnational corporations in particular as key levers, policy levers, to diversify away from staples.
Yeah, it's such a great question. I mean, I think the whole mechanism, the machine of agriculture R&D is situated around a handful of crops, maize, rice, wheat, potatoes. That said, I think, Laura, there's quite a shift changing. And you saw it during the UN Food System Summit around this idea of traditional crops, or what they're now calling opportunity crops, these long held crops like millets and sorghum. Quinoa is one from the Andes, in which these crops are being found not only to be climate resilient, but have important nutritional properties. And there's a really interesting initiative right now led out of the US State Department called VAX, Vision for Adopted Crops and Soils, led by Carrie Fowler. And this is really trying to improve the agronomy and the climate resilience of these traditional crops. And there's a whole handful of them. There are about 30. So I think it's starting to shift. I think that the CGIAR, that does a lot of research, is starting to look at these crops more carefully, because they're realizing that we can't just rely on a handful of crops. It's really starting to put landscapes at risk. So, but that said, there's still a huge investment in maize, rice, and wheat, and continues to be so. And it's in all of our products. But as there's a more demand for some of these unique crops, or sometimes you'll see them called ancient crops in the grocery store and things like that, I think we'll see some momentum. Millets is a great story in India. Millets has really become a huge thing with the prime minister promoting them. But again, there's a whole range of millets. And there's only like 2 varieties that are being promoted highly in India, but there's a whole range with different nutritional, agronomic, climate resilient properties. So we need to start looking more at the whole basket. Yeah.
Yeah, just this morning I had a conversation about millets with a researcher here at WashU, actually. Yeah.
Yeah.
Do others have questions? As Shelly said, come off mute and see us and ask your question. Looks like Deborah might be appearing.
Thanks so much. I really, really appreciate the presentation. And I really appreciate as well when you talked about we need to sit with policymakers and provide them the evidence that they need to help move forward to change policy. It's so hard to do. And I was struck by your slide that you talked about some of the strategies we can use around taxing unhealthy foods and taxing junk foods, and obviously we've taxed sugar sweetened beverages, and the policymakers I've worked with have said that sounds like such a great way to go, but define for me unhealthy foods, define for me junk food, because they're in the position of having to write the legislation and then dealing with the various entities that profit in many ways off of these foods. Do you have any suggestions, even for research moving forward, or for all of the evidence that's out there, as to what we can do to help them to move policies forward that can do some of the strategies you just talked about, which is incentivize companies to not do unhealthy foods, or to tax accordingly? Do you have any insights into that, or additional insights? Because I really think that that's a key area that for years we've been trying to deal with and just haven't done it successfully enough.
Yeah, it's such a great question, Deborah, and thanks for coming to the seminar. On the defining healthy foods, there's been attempts to try to define what's healthy and unhealthy, and Carlos Montero has done this NOVA classification of what is a minimally processed to what he calls an ultra processed food. And not everyone agrees with that classification, but I think a lot of people are starting to rally around that. But again, controversial with even within nutrition groups about this classification. I think most of the nutrition community agrees to what is considered the components of a healthy diet, but getting down to the individual foods is what makes it hard. So then taxing those foods gets harder, just as you said. I used to work in 2 UN agencies, and sometimes you sit on these committee of food security sessions, and that's when all the countries come together and debate on topics. And you really see it, Deborah, around what is a healthy food. And you see some countries really push back on calling things highly or ultra processed, like the United States. They scratch it from any sort of negotiating. They do not want to hear about processed foods. They also don't want to hear about regenerative agriculture in these meetings. But and it makes it hard, right? So like soda is kind of the easy one to tax, right? But countries who have attempted to tax junk food and what that means, WHO has tried to help, and Laura probably knows this space better than I do, around setting certain standards or maximums of sugar and salt content. And then if products go above that, they get labeled or they get taxed. So those setting standards are becoming increasingly powerful for governments to do. The question is does a tax or does a label significantly improve diets? It may change purchasing patterns, but I think still there's some evidence to be gathered around, does it really change diets and nutrition and health outcomes? Some argue yes, some argue very little.
Yeah, and that makes it hard for a policymaker to kind of put their neck out to push something forward. They're looking for the absolute answer, which we don't, we really aren't going to have the absolute answer in many ways. And so, yeah, I think it's such a challenge for us in trying to provide what type of evidence they need to help.
Yeah. And I think some countries, it's different depending on where you go. Chile instituted a warning sticker on the front of their packs where you got a warning sticker if it was high in sugar, salt, or unhealthy fats. But they went further and regulated those foods. You couldn't sell them near or in schools. You couldn't advertise them at certain hours of TV watching when children were watching. I mean, this kind of, not only a front of the pack label, but regulating those foods. That in the US would be incredibly hard to do.
Yeah.
Right? I mean, so I think it depends too on the country. Like a lot of things have been tried in Berkeley, California, but that doesn't mean they're going to work everywhere else in the country, right?
In Missouri. We try to reduce sugar and you have sugar lobbyists, banging on the door pretty quickly.
Yeah. So it's a challenge. It's a true challenge that you pointed out. Yeah.
So I see Rick Stein, welcome. Thanks for coming, has put a thoughtful comment in the chat. Would you like to come on? And
thanks.
yeah.
This was just about the tax issue. Deborah's question about taxes. Yeah, I've heard it only works if it's in the shelf price. If it's added at the register, it doesn't change behavior. And if it only works if it's per calorie, not specific foods like sugar sweetened beverages or.
Yeah. And that there's been some studies. I think it was in Philadelphia where Laura, you might know this better than I do. With the sugar sweetened beverage tax, people went outside the tax.
Exactly. That's exactly right.
Purchased around the perimeter.
Yes.
Yeah.
It's complicated.
People are savvy. Yeah. And I think when it gets into starting to add labels on environmental sustainability or taxing high carbon foods, all bets are off around that. Really complicated, potentially regressive. As Laura knows, animal source foods can be very important from a nutrition perspective, particularly for nutritionally vulnerable populations. So that could be quite detrimental for some populations to have a tax on things like beef.
Yeah, I wanted you to, our usual conversation, Jess, about life course too, the differences across the life course. I really loved how you portrayed and illustrated the disparities regionally, but there are also these differences across the life course. And several people on the call actually work in parts of the life course, like maternal and young child, that may require more of the animal source food than others, and actually older adults as well.
Yeah, and that was the big controversy with the Eat Lancet Commission, right? It set out this kind of one diet for the planet. And people don't eat one diet. You know, there's lots of varieties, and some people are going to need more animal source foods. I mean, Laura's shown this in her own studies. And so that one size fits all is not necessarily going to work.
Right.
It's not so simple to say everyone needs to move towards veganism, because that could be quite detrimental for some populations.
Yeah.
Who are already struggling to meet their micronutrient needs.
Exactly. Any remaining questions in our final minutes? Well, I know that I'm biased, Jess, but I think what you have spoke on today is one of the single most important societal challenges that we have to deal with, which is how do we nourish 8 billion people sustainably? And you've done a beautiful job just presenting the complexity of that, but also with these really positive solutions. So thank you. Thank you for sharing your time and your expertise, and for affecting change, because you're doing that too, which is remarkable.
Well, thank you so much for having me. Thanks.